Okay, so we're going into chapter 4, which is about the motherboard, but it's really about the motherboard and the CPU in chapter 4 because there isn't a separate chapter on CPUs, nor does there really need to be. So we're going to talk about this chapter, the different types of motherboards, the components on the motherboards. The big thing that we're going to take away from this chapter is we need to be able to easily identify when we look at the motherboard where things connect. Because obviously we can't fix stuff if we don't know how it plugs in. So we need to know what all the different kind of parts and plugs there are on a motherboard. We also need to be able to identify what kind of processor goes in a specific motherboard. By the time you're done, hopefully you know how to select the best motherboard for yourself if you wanted to go and upgrade and buy one. If you go home and look at your PC, you may have a box that's perfectly fine, a hard drive that's perfectly fine, a CD-ROM that's perfectly fine, a power supply that's perfectly fine, and your computer stinks. And that may be just because you've got an older motherboard and CPU, and hopefully by the end of this chapter you would be able to select a motherboard CPU combo that fits into what you already own so that you can upgrade your PC. A motherboard CPU combo is the most expensive upgrade because it's the biggest, most important part, but if you've got a really old computer, that may be what's required. And we're going to look at some ATX cases here and pull them out and pull out some motherboards here in a little bit, hopefully today if we get time. So we want to understand the different types of motherboards and all the components that are on the motherboard by the unit, okay? When we select a motherboard, it determines the CPU that we put in there. There's two major CPU manufacturers, Intel, which everybody knows about, and that's what's in your laptop. And then AMD, American Micro Devices, is the other CPU manufacturer that you may or may not know about. We have several servers here at school that have AMD processors, and a motherboard has a socket type. It's called the socket set. It's the kind of plug that the CPU goes into, and it's part of the form factor of the motherboard. And the motherboard then determines the kind of CPU and the speed of CPU that can go in there. I can't just go and take this PC and throw any CPU I want into it and say, "Whoa, now it's really fast." It has to be one that the CPU and the motherboard match up. There's a chipset on the motherboard that determines how the communication, how the information goes around the motherboard, and this is not changeable. You buy the chipset, it's welded on and part of the motherboard when you get it, so that determines the chipset. The motherboard determines how much expansion capability we have later on. If we get a motherboard that only has one expansion slot, that's all we're ever going to get. It's not like we can add expansion capabilities onto a motherboard. So when we initially make our motherboard selection, we need to make sure that we're getting a motherboard that will expand as far as we're going to need it to go. The worst thing is to make a PC and then realize you need one more slot, like one more network card or something. So it determines the number of expansion slots, it determines the type of memory. Again, the motherboard only takes a specific kind of memory. You can't put any memory in there. So if yours takes slow memory, takes the older kind of memory, there's no way you can put it in there. So the only way to upgrade your memory in some cases is to upgrade your motherboard first. And then the form factor of the motherboard determines the type of case. Will those holes line up, and will it be able to be screwed into that case that you've got? So the motherboard determines all of those things. Now, when we look at the motherboard, the first thing that I just mentioned was the CPU socket. Okay? And I talked in chapter 1 about how the ATX motherboard, which is the majority of what we're going to be using and it's what all our projects are going to be about, are lined up with our expansion, our integrated components, and then our CPU socket, and then our memory. That's part of the ATX motherboard form factor. They're all like this: integrated components, CPU, memory. And then they all have the expansion stuff down here. And how much this is really determines, is it a mini case that I need? Is it a normal ATX case? Is it an extended case? Okay. Of the things we pay attention when we buy to what comes integrated in there, because I can't add integrated stuff, and it comes integrated, I save money. Okay. I don't have to put in a separate sound card if I don't need to, right? If I'm not using this as a surround sound system for a studio or something, I may be perfectly happy with the sound that comes out of there. But if I don't have the right sound coming out of there, in the case this is very limited sound, I've only got 3 plugs in it. If I had 6 plugs, I'd have at least 6 channel, if not 8 channel audio on there. I'm going to be able to do a lot more with it. So what kind of integrated stuff I have, I need to decide that early. What am I looking for? And when we do our motherboard project, it's going to be very laid out what kind of things we're looking for. And then my CPU socket, what kind of processor goes in there? If I get the wrong kind of processor socket, then I can only put very specific kinds of processors in there. And I'm looking for my, okay. This one has pins on it. It's for a PGA socket, or a pin grid array socket. This one is flat. It's for an LGA or a land grid array socket. There's no way to make those two, even though they're really, really, really similar in size. This one's not going in this motherboard, no matter what I do. So you really need to make sure that you get the right socket when we're looking at things, okay? Because that's not changeable. Every single year on this motherboard project, somebody screws that up. Every single year. They'll have 3 motherboards of one kind of 2 motherboards of one kind of socket, and a third one that's totally different. And the whole point is that you're doing all the same, okay? So then the kind of memory that we've got down here, it wasn't on my pen, the kind of memory and the number of memory slots matters. Do you have 2? Do you have 4? Do you have 8 memory slots? Determines how much memory I can put in there, and no matter what I do, I can't add memory slots. Okay, and then I've got all my expansion capabilities down here, and what other things are integrated on our motherboard. Okay, so I'm going to go on to a newer picture. I think the next one's a little bit newer. Okay, so this socket right here, and we're going to talk about the different kind of sockets on motherboards, is a PGA, or a pin grid array. Okay, socket. Hope all your brains are catching all this since nobody's going to know. Okay, it's a pin grid array socket. It's also called a ZIF, or zero insertion force socket. In other words, when I put the CPU in this one, it requires no force to do so. I'm going to open this one up and take this off real quick and show you what I'm talking about when we put in a ZIF socket. This is the older kind of socket on a motherboard. And Intel, for the most part, does not use a PGA socket anymore, but AMD, for the most part, still does. We're taking off the CPU cooling fan to get to the CPU. You guys can't see it. Let me see. I'll jump out here. So, the CPU cooling fan is off there. I'm going to pull this out. So now what I've got here is I've got my motherboard with my socket. To get to a ZIF socket requires me to undo this lever. And what this lever does, do you see that mechanism moving back and forth? There are 2 parts of this, and the holes line up when it's up, and when I put the lever down, it goes off slightly to lock the CPU in. So it catches all those pins. So when I do this, the pins aren't caught anymore. And zero insertion force means that I should be able to line it up, and it should just drop right in. And when I go and put that CPU in, I put a little bit of pressure on it to make sure it's all the way in, as I put down the lever and lock the lever on. So that's a zero insertion force socket. It's also a PGA socket that goes on that. And most of our AMD sockets are PGA, and you're going to be looking at sockets called AM2 and AM3 sockets this year. So half of you guys are going to do motherboards that are AMD based, and half of you are going to do ones that are Intel based. So you can see the differences in CPUs and motherboards. when you look at it. Also on the motherboard, we've got very specific DIMM slots. You can see those for our memory. And the colors mean something. Colors mean they should go in pairs if possible, and you should put them in the same color at the same time. Motherboard has different ways that it looks at memory, and if it has colored ones, it synchronizes the reading and writing of that memory so that it runs faster. So if you put a stick here in this green one and a stick here in that orange one, it will not run as fast as if you put both sticks of equal size in the green ones. Motherboards today, you don't have to do that. You don't have to, but you should. It will run faster. It used to be when I first started working on PCs, if you didn't put the right memory in the right place, the computer just didn't start. It'll still start. It might have warnings saying this computer could run faster if the memory was realigned or reset, and it's trying to tell you that it's not in paired mode the way it should be in order to get the best performance, but it'll still run. Then down here we've got our PCI Express slots. These two right here are PCI. Oh, PIC, that's good. Let's see. Probably X16 or X8 slots, which are used for video cards. And when you go to look at your motherboard, you really need to look closely at what kind of video card slot you got, because it's very specific on the projects you guys are going to be doing. And you have to get a gamer one that has at least 2 high-end video card slots for our gamer slots, and that's what these really long ones are here. And then these, actually all 3 of these right here, are normal PCI slots. And when I say normal, I mean the original PCI slot that came out. That's what these 3 are right here. PCI, by the way, stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. It means extra stuff plug. Okay, peripheral means on the outside, component means extra. Okay, so extra component interconnect means plug. Okay, so it's called a PCI plug. And then we've got these little tiny ones here, which are PCI Express 1 slots. They're actually faster than these. It's really kind of hard to find sometimes cards that fit in these, but they're nice and small. And one of the reasons they're up next to the video card is because sometimes the video card takes up 2, so it's kind of a worthless slot a lot of times. So that's that one. This is a Intel motherboard, and this is what an LGA or land grid array socket looks like. LGA sockets are the newest, best one for several years from Intel. And one of the reasons I really like the LGA socket is because it's really, really hard to hurt anything on an LGA CPU. Because there's no pins, short of you dropping and scratching the CPU, it would be really hard for you to damage this one. That one that's sitting out here, this one you can already see students ruined this one because they dropped it and the pin's bent. Once the pin's bent, there are so many pins, 478 pins on this, that it would be really, really hard to straighten them out and have it drop straight in. However, on this LGA one, there's nothing to bend, you can only scratch it, right? And it's really easy to put these in. LGA sockets are kind of telltale because that little hook right here on this graphic, it has a lever arm that comes down with that hook, so it still locks. This lever arm just comes up, and then this, it's easier to just drop it, but it flips up, and then this just sets in there. That's all there is to putting in an LGA socket. So if you've got a motherboard with an LGA socket and you want to upgrade it, almost can't do it wrong. Okay? There's only one way to put it in. There's little notches on there, and you can see the notches around turn it. See the notches here and here, and they're those same notches. If I look at the motherboard, see the notches right there and there. It's really hard to put it in wrong. If I put it in this way, it's not going to go down flat, and it's obvious that it's not in there. Whereas if you put it in the right way, it goes flat in there really well. And then all you do is close that, snap it in, and your CPU's in there. So the LGA socket is nice, and it's not that AMD doesn't use it, but in general, if you see this, it's an Intel. Okay, if you ever see this question on a test, if you can't tell otherwise, it means this is an Intel-based CPU, and if you see this one with the pins, it means it's an AMD-based CPU, because mostly AMD uses this one, and mostly Intel uses this one. Yes, they each have one kind of anomaly. Actually, no, Intel really doesn't anymore. Even though those are Intel CPUs, Intel doesn't make any PGA sockets anymore. They're all LGA, and really AMD is almost all PGA except for like one they play with. Okay. So as I look at this, I see the socket right there, which in this case we already said is LGA. For land grid array, I can tell from the hook that it's an LGA socket, and I know just from this picture and nothing else, this is an Intel-based CPU. It doesn't mean it's an Intel motherboard. All these, as you guys look at them, you're going to find out that Intel and AMD don't make motherboards. Companies like Gigabyte, MSI, Asus, there's tons of companies that make motherboards. And so you have to go and find the Gigabyte motherboard. The Gigabyte motherboard that has the right socket that fits your processor or your what you're looking for. And the thing is, when you guys do this project, you're going to get, okay, Levia's got Intel, and he's got to do LGA sockets, and he's going to pick motherboards, and then the next project is on CPUs, and he has to pick CPUs that then match the motherboards that he picked in the project before. Okay, which is a gotcha sometimes, because people go, oh, this is an awesome CPU. I'm going to use this CPU to put in my gamer motherboard, and then when you show us your gamer motherboard, the two don't go together. Okay, so that's kind of a gotcha too. So same thing, I've got my integrated components right here on my back. And those are the ones that pop through that back plane cover back here. And then I've got my CPU, and I've got my memory down here. Again, it's color coded.
Mr. Island, please call extension 1201.
In this case, this one is a better motherboard in my opinion. I like Gigabyte, by the way. And the reason I say that, I don't know why that just happened, is because the colored slots are not next to each other. Okay? Memory gets hot, just like everything else in the CPU, in the PC, when it's being used. So why would I want the two that are going in together to be the two that are smashed right up against each other, so they get even hotter? When I pick a motherboard, I prefer one like this, so that when I put my memory in, I know it's spaced out. I know if I only put two sticks in, they're not even going to be close to each other, thereby dissipating less heat. And when you guys get to the memory section, you're going to see that memory can come with these big, huge heat sinks on them too. So if you have these big, huge heat sinks, they may not fit right next to each other either. If you're getting gamer memory that gets specifically hot. And I'm looking at this one, and I can see that I've got my two PCI slots for my video cards right here. These are PCI Express, and I'd have to look at the specs on the motherboard to know exactly which kind they are. There's no way for me to look at it and see. But these are normal PCI ones right here, which is called PCI, and these are called PCI Express X1, and those are those little tiny ones down there. So the PCI Express ones are still better than normal PCI, which is what these are. But I'll be honest, these haven't never totally caught on. A lot of manufacturers are still making PCI cards and didn't just start making these, or these would have gone away eventually. Also, my motherboard, this one sticks out really well. Things that I need to learn what they are is all these other connectors on here that I can connect other stuff up to. Now, hopefully you guys know what this is from last chapter. What is this? Power, right? So there's one of my power connectors. There's my other power connector right there. So as I look at all these motherboards, I should be able to go, oh, the power connector is right there. And if there's an extra one, it's usually close to the CPU. There's an extra one. This is another power connector, but this actually goes with the video card if you put a high-end video card in that one. So another one further back there. So here I've got my power connector there, and there's the extra power connector right there. So hopefully the power connector I can easily identify. These other ones I need to learn to identify in this chapter. These right here are called SATA connectors, and those are what my hard drives and my CD-ROM pop into. So it just uses this SATA cable that has a little L on it. This one is not color-coded because it only has one kind, but a lot of times you'll see them, and it's really easy to plug in. It just plugs in and then plugs in the hard drive or the CD-ROM. This one only has two as well. Down here, this one's easier to see. It says right here, it says SATA 0 and SATA 2. You would always want to put your hard drive with the operating system on it on the lowest number one, because that's the one that's going to look at first by default. Okay? So if I was hooking up a hard drive, I'd plug it in here to SATA 0. If I was plugging in a CD-ROM, I'd plug it in over here to the one that says SATA 2. And there's a spot for a SATA 1 and a SATA 3, but it was never put on this motherboard. It could have easily been put on. The connections are right there that you can already see. That's just something needed. Dell decided when they made this motherboard they wanted to put it with two SATAs, even though the motherboard was made for 4. In the case of this one, the different colors actually are probably different speeds. There's 3 different speeds of SATA. Appropriately, there's SATA 1, SATA 2. We're not too complicated in the computer world. And SATA 3. This one went at 150 meg. This one went at 300. This one goes at 600. You'll also see it listed as 3 gigabits per second and 6 gigabits, not gigabytes per second, and 1.5 gigabytes per second. Okay, gigabits, sorry. Or this is megabytes or gigabits, but we're getting the same thing. So if we got a SATA 3 connector, it's obviously twice as fast as SATA 2, and a SATA 2 is twice as fast as SATA 1. They, for all intents and purposes, I have not seen SATA 1 on a new motherboard in a while. They're usually all SATA 2 and SATA 3 connectors. And I would bet, not looking at the specs on this one, that these are SATA 2 and these are SATA 3. Just gonna bet. If these were SATA 3, why would you even have those two? Usually it's the opposite. If there's more of one color than another, usually the ones are SATA 3 and the ones are SATA 2. So the faster this number is, the higher this number is, the better this number is, the faster we transfer data off our hard drive, the faster our operating system loads, the faster programs open up, the faster programs run. If they're a big, huge program like a game, there are some games like Skyrim, that's an 8 gig game that uses a lot of memory, and if you put it on a slow, older hard drive, it runs like poo, because it's going to the hard drive all the time. Office does not go to the hard drive all the time. It's really not that huge of a program. If you have any memory at all, it usually loads up, and then you're done. So the slow hard drive doesn't hurt you on that. So these are our SATA connectors. This one down here, it's just a floppy disk drive connector. And also one that looks very similar to that is the old kind of hard drive connector, which is what this one is right here, called a PATA connector. The SATA stands for serial ATA. And PATA PATA stands for parallel ATA. Okay, so this connector looks very different than this connector. Only one thing can be connected here, whereas on the older serial connectors, I don't even know where I put all those cables. We don't use them anymore. We made a concerted effort to get rid of all the serial ATA connections, the parallel ATA connections in the school over the last year. And the reason for that is the fastest connection on a PATA is 100. And the slowest connection on a SATA is 150. Okay? So no matter what, first of all, I can plug two things into this. So, okay? And it goes the speed of the slowest thing connected, unless the motherboard's smart enough to know how to do that. Okay? So I have one of these PATA connectors, and we usually here just use these for CD-ROMs, and that's it. They're fast enough for a CD-ROM. But the PATA connector, which you're still going to learn how to connect up and stuff when we get to that section on how to configure it and stuff, can still go for older hard drives and CD-ROMs. But like I said, the PATA keep speeds were 33, 66, and 100, and then SATA came out, and they were 150, 300, and 600. Why would I want this for a hard drive, right? So that's why we've really, last year, that was one of the biggest things we did, was to get all the PATA drives out of every single machine, because they're just too dang slow. Especially compared to SATA 2, which is what we have most of. It's 3 times faster than the fastest PATA drive. And I guarantee you we had some PATA drives that were still 66. So now you're talking about 4.5, 5 times faster of a newer hard drive than an older one. 5 times faster is a lot faster. So we try to get away from using that connector at all anymore, and the only thing we use it for is for CD-ROMs that we really barely use, right? Often you put in a CD at school, very infrequently, if ever at all, unless it's in this class to test something. So here's a higher end video, a gamer system. We've got 2 high-end video cards right here on those PCI X16. There's our little connector that goes between the 2 cards. If they're either SLI or Crossfire ready, I think that says Crossfire on it right there, so it's a Crossfire card. So that makes these 2 high-end video cards act as one, which is really nice. Never been able to afford to do that myself, but I'd love to try it sometime. And then we've got our memory down here. We've got our CPU and our CPU cooling fan, then we've got our integrated components right there. So, and whenever we have a PC, just so you know, and our CPU, this nasty looking grease stuff on here is called grease. It's thermal grease or thermal paste. And whenever we put it on, basically you don't just put a CPU in like this. You can see it's mostly cleaned off of this one. We don't just put a CPU in and then put the piece of metal on top of it. What we do when we put the CPU in is we put that thermal grease on, and the idea is that it helps the heat dissipate to the heat sink, and this is what it looks like when you get it in a large quantity. It's in a syringe, and we just squish it on there, and then usually use, I'll leave this out, we squish it on there and usually use a credit card or something like that to level it out as level as we can. This is a lot, by the way. Normally, if you were to buy it, you wouldn't buy a huge syringe because that's to do like 100 CPUs. Normally, when you buy it personally, you get it in something like, I have one of these. Just for looking for something on my desk. I come for my own testing part yesterday. I'm going to blame Mr. Anderson for tearing my desk apart too. I just found it out yesterday. Well, it looks like a little model paint container that has its own brush and stuff on it. Anybody do modeling? You know what I'm talking about when I say model paint container? Ah. What did I do with it? Things like this, I feel like I'm a mad scientist when I'm looking for stuff on this. Ah! Well, anyways, it comes in a little tiny container with a, like this big. It's really small. Probably end up finding it for next block. I'm not feeling rushed. But you have to put that on the CPU before you put the fan on or it won't match up real well. They're really to fill microscopic holes and I used to be like, how important is that? We have computers go down all the time and I'll open it up. There's no thermal paste or thermal grease. And we redo it, it solves the whole problem. Okay, I'm going to stop here in a second because we're going to open up some PCs. In fact, I'm going to stop right there. We're going to do some PC stuff just to give us a nice little break and